Welcome to another edition of the Oath and the Office podcast. I am John Fugelsang. It is so good to be with you again. It has been a very crazy week, friends. The Supreme Court has ruled that Donald Trump can dismantle the entire Department of Education, but somehow Joe Biden can't cancel student loans. So let's go to the man himself, the star of the podcast, to help us make sense of this weary world. Professor Corey Brettschneider, the man, the Mac, with a PhD in politics from Princeton, a law degree from Stanford, and he's used these powers to enrich the lives of students in the poli-sci department at Brown University. I remember growing up reading Professor Brettschneider back in the 50s in the New York Times and CNN, MSNBC, and he is the author of The Oath and the Office, A Guide to the Constitution for Future Presidents. I also recommend his book, The Presidents of the People, 5 Leaders Who Threatened Democracy and the Citizens Who Fought to Defend It. Professor Brettschneider, it's great to see you.
Thanks so much, John. I'm looking forward to this episode. Of course, the constitutional crisis deepens, and we'll talk about the dismantling of the Department of Education against the legislation that protects it. We'll talk about the danger that Trump might do something truly unprecedented and try to fire the Fed chair and the complications. But most of all, as eager as I am to talk about those issues,
We got a guest today. We got a special guest, Professor.
Eager to talk about that. And we are going to have the Attorney General from New Mexico, Raúl Torrez, actually a fellow graduate of Stanford Law School. And it's going to be an amazing discussion because really the front lines right now, after the destruction of so much of the power of the federal courts in the Birthright Citizenship case, is coming from attorneys general. And they are also on the front line specifically of the Birthright Citizenship case. So this is a really important episode for people, essential, I'd say, because you're going to get a close eye look at what's actually happening in the battle against Trump's attempt to destroy the Constitution.
Well, I'm looking forward to speaking with the Attorney General and making him seem even more brilliant in comparison to me and my dumb questions, Professor. But before we get to him, I want to just talk about a few things here. Just to be clear, so we understand, and help me out, you're the constitutional professor. I'm the vulgar vaudevillian here. According to our court, canceling debt to help working people is unconstitutional. Canceling student loan debt to help working people is unconstitutional. But canceling the department that holds the debt and funds the schools and enforces civil rights is totally fine. Now, the Department of Education isn't dismantled yet, but Trump is making moves to shrink it after the Supreme Court and the Dirty Six gave him the green light to fire more than 1,300 Education Department workers. Apparently, Professor, in America now, giving poor people a break is tyranny, but letting a twice-impeached game show host turn the DOE into a smoldering crater of ignorance is just executive discretion. Corey, it seems like this is not just an attack on the separation of powers. It's an attack on the separation of stupidity from power. And how did they do it? The way they always do, through that shady-ass shadow docket, no arguments, no transparency. You've taught me this. 6 black robes, ghosting democracy like it's an ex they owe rent to. Now, Justice Sotomayor called this ruling indefensible. It wasn't about education policy. It's about control. It's about indoctrination by subtraction. You destroy the federal oversight. You've taught me this. You let the states run wild. So Alabama can teach creationism here, and Florida can replace history books with Bible coloring sheets, and Mississippi can just write, y'all figure it out on a chalkboard. I mean, Professor, if the court has now sided with this administration in every injunction challenge, right? Every one. Most recently, the green light for these firings at DOE. Can you walk us through what's really at stake here constitutionally, besides Americans getting a lot more dumb?
Thanks, John. What a brilliant intro. And the emotion and the details both get to how serious this is. And let me start with the point that you made that I don't want listeners to miss. And we've talked about it before, but you're really starting to see how pernicious it is. And that's the idea that the court made this decision about the Department of Education through its emergency order procedure, or what's more commonly being called, and it's a nice name for it, the shadow docket. What is the shadow docket? One of the things that always made the court, in my eyes, less partisan, less political than the other branches was its need to give reasons, that it would decide and you would have an opinion. You would say, why did they do this? What is the shadow docket? It's just a vote, and it's just a decision. And so giving a green light essentially to the dismantling of the Department of Education, if you were to ask me, what are the court's reasons? I could guess, but we don't know. And that really is a kind of destruction of democracy. Let me just say what's at stake here, too, pulling out from your great introduction. What's at stake is the fact that we have a lot, I was going to say tons, lots of legislation on the books mandating that the executive branch guarantee education in various forms to students throughout America. Now, that doesn't mean that they dictate the curriculum, as some have falsely claimed, but it does mean that, for instance, low-income students get funds through Title I. It means that there are all sorts of protections when it comes to the disabled or handicapped. It means that there are protections based on gender. We could go through the list. Dating back to the Johnson administration, Lyndon Johnson, to guarantee a basic minimal education. And so if you don't have a department to carry it out, and not to mention, too, the legislation setting up the Department of Education in the first place, maybe the most important thing, if you have a president who thinks he can just undo all of that, it really is nothing less than the dismantling of law. And if it was just this one case, okay, but it's part and parcel of a larger assault on not just the judiciary, which we've talked about at length, but on against Congress. And that's why I've been using this language since we started the podcast. That might sound extreme, of a self-coup, a destruction of the other branches by the president.
I keep telling you as well, the Vatican doesn't allow Catholics to self-coup themselves. I don't know if you know that, but I want to point that out. Corey, but there's another kind of dismantling going on here as well, because what we're seeing at DOE, to me, Professor, seems more than a personnel shakeup. It looks more like a coordinated attempt to gut the modern administrative state. From a constitutional standpoint, Professor, how does that erode the balance of powers between the executive branch and Congress? And what does it mean when Congress is just willingly giving it up?
Well, Congress shouldn't have the right to just give it up, although it is going along with this dismantling of congressional power, because, of course, this is his base. But what it's undoing is the work of previous Congresses. All these pieces of legislation dating to the 60s in particular, and updating it throughout time, they create mandates for an executive branch that the way the system is supposed to work is charged with executing the law. The president takes an oath to faithfully execute the office. And also in Article 2, it talks about his main obligation to faithfully execute the law. That means that laws passed in the 70s and the 80s and the 90s have to be carried out with the executive branch. And when the executive branch just refuses to do that, that is an assault on Congress. It's a complicated idea, maybe in some ways.
No, it's not.
Or maybe it's not. Yeah,
laws not. It's separation of powers.
That's what everyone was taught in grade school. The president's supposed to execute the laws, and they have a very different idea, the idea of the unitary executive, which really would be used by this president to dismantle the powers of Congress.
You know, it's amazing how much we learned when Donald Trump was serving his first term. We had so many civics lessons, right? We had to learn things like the 25th Amendment. We had to learn things like how to pronounce the words ivermectin and hydroxychloroquine. What I've learned from you, Corey, is the words we need to learn for Trump's second term are, well, it's shadow docket, and it's self-coup, and it's unitary executive theory. You mentioned it already, but that's what they're using to justify these firings.
Yes.
How is this legal foundation to consolidate executive power all that different from a monarch?
Well, I really think, as I argue in The Presidents and the People, that there's a longstanding authoritarian tradition in the United States of presidents who have really tried to dismantle the system of separation of powers. And I talk, for instance, about Adams and his explicit embrace of monarchy. But as much as the defenders of the unitary executive pretend that that specific theory dates back to the founding, it really is based in the 1980s. And the history of the unitary executive dates to Edwin Meese, who was the Attorney General for Ronald Reagan, and a real partisan who believed that Nixon had been unfairly limited in his power, taken down, and that really the presidency and Reagan's presidency was being stymied by Congress, which was asserting its power too much. And so he really wanted to assault Congress's ability to, make law, and to change the office of the president from one that was just charged with executing the law to one that really had discretion to decide what laws to enforce and what not, how to enforce them, and most importantly, who to hire and who to fire. And they really focused the unitary executive theory on the idea of hiring and firing. Now, what are the words in the Constitution that say It's not Congress that can create protections, that it's the president of the United States that has the sole discretion. They really point to one phrase, which is the executive power is vested in a president. And they use the idea of unitary executive. There was a discussion at the founding. Should we have multiple executives or just one? And they decide on one. But they combine all of that into what, to my mind, is an autocratic theory, which says the president doesn't have to listen to Congress. It can hire and fire at will. It can pick the laws to follow or not. And the discretion of how to interpret is solely up to the president. That, as you said, just to go to the main point, that unitary executive theory is a theory of autocracy or even monarchy.
Absolutely. And again, it's seemingly being given because there is not any credible resistance in this Republican Congress that is too terrified of being primaried by their own president to maintain the balance of powers. I mean, is this part of a larger coup, legally speaking? Not violence, obviously, but one that will forever gut congressional power by redefining the limits of presidential authority. I mean, when Republicans get shellacked in 2026 and 2028, will a Democratic presidency be able to undo these policies, assuming they want to?
I mean, look, it's not going to be easy. The legislation that created the Department of Education's mandates and then the vast civil service that's carried it out took decades to build. And yet it's being dismantled really in a few months. It's easier to destroy than to build. But that will be the mandate of this next Congress and hopefully a new president and a new Senate that will have to build up. It's not going to happen fast. I don't want to lie to listeners. I'm, of course, optimistic about the possibility and hopeful about the possibility of recovery, but it is much harder to build than it is to destroy. And what this unitary theory does is it gives the ability to destroy these laws. They're not revoking the laws. They're just destroying the civil service that's charged with carrying it out. And as one of the lower court judges said in this education case, if there's nobody there to carry out the laws, in what sense do they exist? There is, as I've said many times, no national curriculum, but there are, for instance, there's a debate about the word standards, but really there are a set of standards, that's a good way to put it, that are enforced, for instance, by the nation's report card, a test that's given to all children throughout the United States that we use to weigh how different states are doing. If there's nobody there to grade the nation's report card, to evaluate it, how the hell are we supposed to carry it out? How are we supposed to allocate the funds in Title I? How are we supposed to do any of the things that we're required by law to do without the civil service? So, legislation to shore up the powers of the Department of Education, but most importantly, rehiring the civil servants to do the work. And in the meantime, as it's dismantled, I just think, yes, in many ways, these laws are going to be gutted. That's why this is so serious.
And here's the thing, you touched on this, but it's worth noting. Trump has tapped to oversee this educational wrecking ball, Linda freaking McMahon, professor. Now, I'm guessing you've spent a lot of time in your academic career watching pro wrestling.
I did as a kid. I have to say,
you...
I even have met Hulk Hogan's son. So,
Oh, okay. Well, then, wow. I didn't realize, Corey, here, I should have been the snob around you all this time. I think it's great. When I was a kid, I thought, wow, pro wrestling's really trying to make America dumber. And now they're cutting out the middleman by, I mean, Trump said this decision allows the education secretary, pro wrestling lady, to return the functions of the Department of Education back to the states. Now, public K through 12 schools are primarily overseen at the local level by school boards. And we've heard K through 12 schools across the country reporting disruptions in funding and issues with financial aid and more since all the federal workers were laid off in March. I mean, I'm not saying education was ever perfect, Professor, but this is sabotage dressed up as policy. This is what happens when you give the power of a library to people who think that books are a liberal hoax. I mean, like, not to be too fun about this, not to turn this into a comedy club, but the GOP is destroying the DOE because an educated population seems to be a threat to their power. You can't run a white nationalist theocracy if people can read past a tweet, and you can't keep them afraid if they understand science, history, and empathy. So it seems like this is really, I mean, we can go back to Thomas Dewey on this. They've been trying to gut our public schools for a very long time. A lot of guys out there don't much care for what Jesus says, but they really like the thought of tax dollars going to religious schools where girls can be taught the virtues of biblical womanhood. I mean, it just seems like they're they're trying to dismantle it, and the court is trying to balance equities rather than weighing basic constitutionality. I mean, it looks like there's a shift in the whole judicial framing to signal this broader deference to executive power, but it's not really consistent with the court's role in history.
No, the courts are, supposed to protect the law. That's the idea of courts. That's the justification of what judges do. And if the laws create mandates for the executive branch to carry them out, in particular in all these areas of education, then the courts are supposed to enforce that. And instead, what they've done is they've acquiesced. I think we think under the theory of the unitary executive, but as I said, we don't know their reasons because of this pernicious shadow docket. And so what they've done is they've handed over the power to Donald Trump and his crony, Linda McMahon, from pro wrestling, having run the Pro Wrestling Federation and having watched too much pro wrestling as a kid. I can tell you, this is not somebody who cares deeply about education. She's used to a kind of theater, that's what, of course, what pro wrestling is. And she doesn't even seem to know what the department does. And so when she says things like we're returning education to the states do control curriculum. They do control basically all the decisions about how schools are run. What the federal government does is it aids poor schools. It ensures that there are standards that are met throughout the country, and that we at least know how the schools around the country are performing or not, so that we could have the data to see where more funds are used or where more improvement is needed if it's not just an issue of funds. And this isn't somebody who understands that. And when they sent in Doge, they seemed to just not understand what they were doing and just randomly start to upheld the scaffold. But here's the thing. Let's just get real about this. As you said, this administration doesn't want an educated populace, because an educated populace is going to challenge authoritarianism. They want deference. And what the great, and I should call out, and including friends and colleagues who are working in these departments, including the State Department, which is itself going to be gutted, and the Department of Education, they don't see their role as loyalty to Trump. They see it as loyalty to the law, to do the thing that they're charged with doing, and as part of the executive branch, do what the president's supposed to do, execute the law. That's not what he wants. And that's why Project 2025 recommended and outlined a plan for how to actually destroy the civil service under the fake name, the deep state. And that's what they're doing. And just, again, I can't hammer it home enough. They are undermining the legacy of law that took decades to accomplish. And this was not just, I've mentioned Lyndon Johnson, but, a lot of the legacy, too, is from George Bush, just destroyed by this gutting of the Department of Education.
Okay, I could talk about this for days, Corey, but I know the story's not going away. Let's take a quick one, and we'll come back and talk a bit about the first president to ever pretend he can fire a Fed chair, because that's a thing now. This is The Oath in the Office. Welcome back to The Oath in the Office. I'm John Fugelsang, along with Professor Corey Brettschneider. So, Corey, Trump's back in the Oval Office holding up a draft letter like he's going to vote somebody off the island. He's trying to fire Jerome Powell, chair of the Federal Reserve, which no president's ever done, the most powerful central bank on earth, and he's trying to fire the guy like he caught him stealing Diet Cokes from the mini fridge. Firing the Fed chair because you don't like interest rates. I don't really know if that's leadership, nor is showing off a letter to other Republicans and asking if you should fire. It's like a fantasy football league with these people. Now, Trump appointed Powell in 2017, and now he wants him gone for not lowering rates fast enough, which isn't really monetary policy. It seems more like an unmedicated mood swing, Corey. I mean, as of today, a federal statute prevents the president from firing the chair without cause. Is that statute constitutional? How might the Supreme Court view this?
It certainly is constitutional in my view, and it's part and parcel of the idea that we've been working with this entire episode, which is Congress can pass laws and it can create ways of making sure that the civil service protects them. So we have something called the Pendleton Act, which protects civil servants rather than political appointees from firing for political reasons. That dates back to the 19th century. And we also have independent agencies where the head of the agency is seen as the agency's mission is so important that we protect that head of the agency from being fired. These independent agencies are a way for Congress to ensure that its laws will be carried out. And that's why the Fed chair is protected from firing for political reasons. The Fed is charged with a dual mandate to protect against inflation and to prevent unemployment. And the Congress created this mechanism, and it did that in several different areas, to make sure that a president, for his or her own purposes, to juice the economy, for instance, couldn't just fire the person at will. And yet Trump, for the first time in American history, is threatening that consensus. Now, here's the worrying part of what I'm talking about. The unitary executive theory is embraced by so much of this court, and although in my mind it undermines the separation of powers, democracy, the rule of law, and brings about a kind of autocracy potentially, they might go along with it. So it is unconstitutional, and yet in the same way they might go away with the revocation of birthright citizenship, that they had the immunity case, despite the fact that there's nothing about immunity in the Constitution.
That's right.
Yes, they might uphold it. That's what's so scary.
What's really scary to me, though, is that we could be looking at a scenario where the court strikes down even more constraints on executive power, allowing Comb over Caligula here to directly control monetary policy, right? I mean, what would that mean for the separation of powers?
Look, if you had Trump in charge, he probably couldn't care less. First of all, he has no idea what he's doing when it comes to the economy. His understanding, according to all experts, is just rudimentary. Now, what would he do? He would lower interest rates to try to juice the stock market as much as he could, which would bring about rampant inflation. And I don't think the markets are going to react well to a President Trump being in charge of the Federal Reserve,
or
a Linda McMahon being
transferred
from WWE to education to Fed chair.
A president firing a Fed chair would be chaos for the markets, right? Even a mook like me knows this. Sorry, Corey, go ahead.
But yet they might uphold it. And that's why we really are on the verge of autocracy.
It's like trying to fire your Uber driver because they won't let you drive, right? I mean, and they're all saying, oh, the Republicans are all live tweeting it, saying firing is imminent, firing is imminent. I mean, this whole economic strategy is basically Trump's going to fire everybody who doesn't treat him like he's the reincarnation of Reagan. If Reagan had failed a civics test and was addicted to Ambien, I mean, he can't fire the Fed chair. What are the implications if the Federal Reserve loses its independence under a second administration of this reality show racist clown? What does that do, Professor, to the rule of law or to the global economy's trust in America and our institutions?
We've been working with several concepts. One of them is the unitary executive, and the other is this idea of what it might lead to. The unitary executive is not an autocratic theory necessarily. Ronald Reagan wasn't an autocrat, but yet the theory paves the way for a president who doesn't have virtue, who is a criminal, a convicted criminal. And when you have somebody like that in charge, who's really seeking to aggrandize his own power, not to mention his own stock portfolio and his own wealth in violation of the Emoluments Clause, that's frightening, because all of a sudden the Federal Reserve, rather than combating unemployment and inflation, might be used to line the pocketbooks of the president and his close cronies and, of course, his family. That's a frightening moment in American history, and that really is the collapse of democracy and the rule of law into a kind of autocracy and a kind of crony capitalism, and that's why the moment is so dangerous. And yes, I hate to say it, but under that theory of the unitary executive, the court might uphold it. It might. I would hope they wouldn't use the shadow docket if they do it. I would hope they don't do it. But that seems to be the pattern here, enabling him through the shadow docket with no reasons, maybe loosely grounded in something like the unitary executive. But we are in a frightening moment in American politics, and it's why, as we welcome the Attorney General from New Mexico and we talk about strategies going forward, we've got to start to fight back.
I just want to point out that he's now tried to take away Rosie O'Donnell's citizenship, and he's trying to fire the Fed chair. And Corey, I'm still not distracted from the Epstein list. I haven't forgotten. I don't know. I'm supposed to be all up in arms about this, but don't look over there at the cover-up. Look at the Fed chair. I might fire him. And he's not going to go through with it because that's his whole thing. He talks like a dictator. He acts like a toddler. And his only economic credentials are that he couldn't run a casino in Atlantic City. If I was Jerome Powell, Professor, here's what I would do. I'd offer to print up $1 trillion coin with Trump's face on it, and then Trump will love me and let me keep my job. That's all it takes. Just massage him the right way, Jerome. I'm here to help. All right, I know you're excited for the Attorney General. Let's take a quick break, and we'll be right back on The Oath and the Office. Welcome back to The Oath and the Office. I am John Fugelsang, and wow, Professor Brettschneider, I know you have been very excited about this next guest. This is quite a booking you nailed, Corey. Well done.
Well, I'm so honored, really, to welcome Attorney General Torrez, undergraduate at Harvard and fellow graduate of Stanford Law School, the same class, actually, 2000 2005. And it's really an honor to have you with us, having been a prosecutor and also elected a local district attorney and now attorney general. One of the many reasons we're interested in talking to you, excited to talk to you, is you're helping to lead the fight, of course, against birthright citizenship. And that's something that we've talked about with the listeners extensively. We'll talk about that. I know that you've also looked into questions around January 6th. I want to ask you about that, and then also talk more generally about the state of our politics, including the recent dismantling of the Department of Education. So Attorney General Torrez, thanks so much for joining the Oath in the Office.
Well, Corey and John, thank you for having me. I really appreciate it. You know, it's interesting that you raised law school. I have had the opportunity to go and speak to some law students around the country and try to give them a sense of what attorneys general do. And one of the things I start off by reminding them is there wasn't anything that I actually learned in law school that prepared me for this particular moment in public service, because virtually any of the things that we learned and took for granted about the separation of powers, about the co-equal, or up until very recently, the idea that all three branches of government were co-equal, a lot of those things have just been completely undermined and obliterated in many respects, not only by the Trump administration, but by the acquiescence of leaders in Congress, by recent decisions in the Supreme Court. And so I find myself kind of reinventing or learning a new language to talk about what it is that we do and how we go about it. I still have my day job, as I like to tell people, of, you know, consumer protection, environmental protection. The chief law enforcement officer of the states. We're involved in complex criminal prosecutions, but there is a whole area of very unique impact litigation that we do at the national level to really try to shape and redefine the appropriate parameters that we have in place, or at least we should have in place. And what I think for the long term, what I'm trying to get Democrats to do is, as we look forward to hopefully reclaiming Congress in the midterms and eventually the White House in the years to come, that we start paying as much time and attention to correcting and fixing and supporting the infrastructure of a constitutional republic to the same extent that we do focus on the day-to-day policy preferences that we have as a party, whether it's healthcare or affordable housing or all the other things. I think what happened with the incoming Biden administration is that in the wake of January 6th, there was this sense that, okay, as horrific as that was, that event in and of itself would be disqualifying for Trump and would be disqualifying for a Trump brand of politics moving into the future. And what that meant is that there was a very quick return to sort of business as usual, or politics as usual, where Democrats were trying to advocate for very specific policy recommendations, but we didn't think about the Alien Enemies Act, whether or not we should, eliminate it, amend it, improve it. We didn't think about impoundment, the Impoundment Act. We didn't think about all of these other below the waterline issues that were sort of missing from our agenda. And while I talk to political science folks and campaign people and pundits a lot of times, I'm very careful to say, well, these are not things that we should run on, because I don't think that talking about the separation of powers and checks and balances is how you convince people to show up at the polls and vote for you.
Sure.
But it needs to be part of the affirmative agenda.
Yeah.
It needs to be. We need to take this moment and all of the assault that has been committed against our traditional norms in our constitutional order, and very specifically come up with a blueprint for changing and shoring up those institutions moving forward.
Right. And I think too, Americans can walk and chew gum at the same time. We can campaign and discuss as a nation pocketbook issues and also think about constitutional restoration. And we've had other moments. We've talked a lot on this show about the 1970s and the recovery from Richard Nixon, the Emergencies Act, the Ethics in Government Act, and we need a renewal. And so I'm so glad to hear up and coming Democratic star talk about the need for not just getting rid of Trump, but for really putting back the kind of things that you and I learned about in 1L Law School. I do want to ask you too, not just about the question of recovery, and I couldn't agree more with what you said, but what to do in the moment, because you really are in the front line of this. And so we've talked with the listeners a lot about the birthright citizenship case, and we've seen the Supreme Court, of course, gut the power of the lower courts to issue universal or nationwide injunctions, whether anything's left there, very little anyway, except one possibility, and this is what I want to ask you about, is the lawsuits by attorneys general. So how do you see, given the Casa decision and the gutting of universal injunctions, your role in your coalition of fellow attorneys general, and specifically in this case? And, listeners really want to know, is there hope? And I think too, we've all read the 14th Amendment. We know that if you're born in the United States, it's pretty simple. I can't imagine that would have been a 1L question when we were in law school. Like, are you a citizen if you're born? That's not a complicated one. It says that you are. So, as you know, that is being challenged under the idea somehow then that undocumented people's children are not subject to the jurisdiction of the United States. I'd welcome you to comment too on the substance of the matter. I know you're of course have looked into it, but what I really want to know is, what can attorneys generals do specifically in this birthright citizenship case? What are you doing? You are in the front lines, and so just get us up to date.
And thank you, by the way, for leading this, Attorney General Torrez, because it's amazing to see what legal avenues states still have to protect birthright citizenship.
We're looking for the hope.
Yeah.
Well, the one silver lining in the work that we do collectively as a group of Democratic attorneys general is that we don't have time for hand wringing, and we don't have time for a lot of the pontificating about how we lost or how we came to this position, because we just have to wake up and fight every day. We started to organize ourselves about a year ago, and I don't know if this is sort of a part of the story that isn't as well known, in part because we didn't talk about it a lot. We didn't talk about Fight Club. We just did it. But we basically assumed, worst case scenario, if the Trump administration were to return to power, let's take Project 2025 at face value as the governing philosophy of the incoming or the returning administration. And then we would organize ourselves collectively around how to respond to that. Obviously, the ability to use universal injunctions has been and was a very specific tool that we relied on to, frankly, extend the kind of constitutional protections that we were fighting for on behalf of the citizens in our state, for the benefit of citizens in neighboring states, right? So Texas, Oklahoma, Utah, other places that are nearby, they don't have AGs that are committed to fighting for these same sorts of principles. And so we would file an action. It was implied by seeking these universal injunctions that we would also protect citizens in neighboring states. The bottom line after the latest decision is that it has never been more important than it is now to elect the right people in positions as attorneys general around the country, so that the citizens in respective states can enjoy the maximum benefit of the work that we do. So the bottom line for us is that in the 22 states and the District of Columbia that are part of this broader group, we are creating something of a patchwork of application in terms of federal policy, because what now, based as I read the decision, folks in uncovered jurisdictions have one set of rules, and I know you talked about this, and those of us in different states have a different set of rules. The problem, as we articulated in the case that went up, Corey, as you know, not on the merits but on this procedural issue, an important procedural issue, was the idea of how does it become workable to have a citizen born here and pursuant to the plain text of the 14th Amendment is entitled to all of the rights and privileges of U.S. citizenship if they're born here, and then when they're 5, they move to an uncovered jurisdiction, right? And it really goes back to a lot of what we learned in the first year of law school about why we have certain issues that require the federal courts to identify and articulate uniform national standards for key constitutional questions like this. Now, I the short answer is I don't actually know. I know what it means for my citizens in my state that remain within my state. What I cannot say is how the litigation of this question unfolds when a child born in Santa Fe today moves to Houston in a month, right? And then they try and get certain paperwork together and they apply for some federal benefit. My hope is that the coverage that we have offered by virtue of our participation in these lawsuits in my state and in others will then follow them, but it's unclear. Now, the court did leave open this idea of organizing class actions, leaving aside the fact that this very conservative court has not been known for like really making class action lawsuits a viable way for people to vindicate their rights.
Quite the opposite, right?
Quite the opposite, right? But let's assume that is something. You can see why people in this situation would be very reluctant to participate in an action like that, and it would also be very difficult for them to organize themselves on a nationwide basis. I know that there has been a subsequent order and a subsequent injunction issued precisely because there was a class action that was organized. But this all raises a very difficult question. And behind all of it, frankly, is a notion that this court only seemed to have problems with nationwide injunctions when Donald Trump was reelected president.
Ding, ding.
Right? Like when Joe Biden was the president, we didn't have any problem at all with a single federal judge in Texas sort of dictating these policies. I don't remember any of that. That said, I think there is some sense that we should move to a place where we don't want one judge making policy for everyone everywhere. I understand that. And even, Justice Kagan and others and people in the Obama and Biden administrations, they had concerns with universal injunctions. Unfortunately, the court didn't really lay out a comprehensive framework. What they did is they took the power away from lower courts, and then they reaffirmed their own ability to step in whenever they feel like stepping in. But we don't know what that looks like. What the American public is left to read into all of this is, well, if it's a conservative president that we agree with, we're not going to exercise that power. We're just going to take a hands-off approach and they get to do what they want. We'll have to wait and see how they apply that when a Democrat returns to the White House. But as Justice Sotomayor pointed out in her dissent, I would be hard-pressed to believe that this court would stand by if some Democrat decided, well, they're going to disregard the plain text of the Second Amendment, confiscate guns all over the country, and this same court would somehow say, well, we're just going to let that play out in litigation for 3 or 4 years and clearly violate constitutional rights and clearly violate these norms. And this goes to the heart of this contest of what we mean about the rule of law. The rule of law means applying the same standards and rules regardless of who's in power and regardless of what ideology you tend to have or political preferences you tend to have. And I think fundamentally, this Supreme Court has done itself real damage in terms of the extent to which the American public believes that this is going to be equally applied. I don't really think that people believe that anymore, and that's the thing that we got to get to the bottom.
I mean, do you have thought? Sorry, John, go ahead.
Oh, you couldn't pay me to take John Roberts' place in history at this point. But I have a couple of questions, Mr. Attorney General, that I'd love to ask Professor if I could jump in from my tiny mind that hasn't been to law school. But is there a risk, sir, that this Supreme Court might reinterpret the 14th Amendment Citizenship Clause to exclude the children of undocumented immigrants? I mean, how unprecedented would that be? And how would that play out in court?
There are certain cases and policy positions that this administration has staked out that I think are probably, from a legal perspective, right, the conservative majority is more able to articulate some sort of interpretation that allows them to reach this conclusion. And I would think that this would not be the case to do that for 2 reasons. Number one, they all are avowed textualists and originalists, right?
Right.
And so if you look at the text, the plain text of the 14th Amendment, it's a pretty straightforward piece of analysis, right? Corey and I never would have gotten this as a law school question, because it's like, read the words, apply,
Right.
the words mean what they mean. And even if there was some ambiguity in it, the Supreme Court itself has interpreted it to mean, in a decision that's, I think, about 127 years old or something like that, that no, it actually means what it says, that everyone born in this country, with the exception of diplomats, for example, they are entitled to citizenship. So the Supreme Court is going to have to do a lot of intellectual gymnastics to reach a contrary perspective. Not the least of which, something that you've discussed on this podcast, which is this idea of what does it mean to be subject to the jurisdiction of the United States? Clearly, this administration believes that people in this category are subject to the criminal jurisdiction of the United States and the civil jurisdiction of the United States when it comes to deportation. So you're going to have a hard time saying, well, they're subject to the jurisdiction if we want to prosecute them or deport them.
Right.
But they're not subject to our jurisdiction when we're talking about handing out citizenship. You can't have it both ways, right? Now, with Justice Alito, Justice Thomas, and increasingly some of the other conservatives on the court, I'm getting to this place, and I kind of started out here where I was very cynical about a lot of this. I think a lot of it has to do with political power just in general. I had some faint hope that John Roberts, precisely because he admired Justice Marshall and others so much for upholding the power and independence of his branch of government, would be more mindful of securing that branch in the large historical sweep. But much in the same way that congressional leaders have stepped back from protecting their branch and their prerogatives, Justice Roberts is kind of doing the same. And they're doing it in a way now, increasingly with the emergency docket, where they just allow things to move forward. They don't have the courage to actually articulate why they're doing what they're doing. And what you're left with are the other justices issuing dissents that are, frankly, the only public reasoning that lawyers need to try and discern what's happening in the country.
But if I hear you right, you're optimistic, it sounds like, that they will read the 14th Amendment, see what it says, which is that if you're born in the United States, that you are a citizen, that they'll see that the jurisdiction argument that John Eastman and others have somehow gotten this far really doesn't hold water, because, of course, undocumented people are subject to the jurisdiction of the United States in all sorts of ways. And then also, to go back to your first point, that there's a kind of universal nature of this. It can't be just true that this is a right in one state. It's got to be true for the United States. That you have optimism, am I right there, despite the fact that the court is so political that they might be too embarrassed to go along with Trump on this one?
I actually think if I were to pick a case that when it comes to the merits, I would be extremely surprised that this court actually reaches a conclusion that is, they would have to reject their own binding precedent on this issue. And they would have to reject it in a way that explains the plain language of the Constitution. A lot of the things that we end up fighting over in constitutional litigation is over implied, implications of what a right might mean. Reproductive rights, for example, the right to privacy, right? You do accept at a certain level that those things are implied rather than a given. This is not one of those places. I mean, it just says explicitly what it is, and then there is a binding precedent. I would think if you were going to see a real reshaping of their perspective, it would be on the unitary executive. It would be on the ability of the president to, even though he's taken this oath to faithfully execute the laws of the country and uphold the Constitution, he's effectively exercising a line item veto on the federal budget. That is a place where maybe they could say, yeah, the Impoundment Act was unconstitutional at inception and we just didn't get a chance to get into it. I can see that as a more likely outcome than reversing 150 years of precedent on birthright citizenship.
that they might split the difference, in other words, and say, look, this is too embarrassing to go along with it here. But when it comes to the dismantling of Congress's power, and we've been talking, of course, a lot about the unitary executive as well. I mean, I did want to ask you about the recent assault, I would call it, on the Department of Education and Congress's power. I know you were involved in litigation in New Mexico about adequate education for the children and citizens of New Mexico. I mean, how do you see this? If we're right, and I think you are right, and of course the recent shadow docket decision to allow basically these firings to go through, at least for now, doesn't suggest that they're really going to stop a lot of this dismantling of the federal government. How do you see the unitary executive theory on the ground affecting things like education and affecting the ability of New Mexico's government to function at the local level?
Well, effectively, the Trump administration and Russell Voigt's vision of the federal government is that that Congress is basically an advisory council. I mean, that whatever they say, it doesn't matter what authority or specific commands they put in federal statutes that are backed up with appropriations, the president is free to apply those or disregard those at his pleasure, right? The problem, Corey and John, as you know, is okay. They are doing that in a context where they are clearly in alignment with this particular president. But unlike the other two branches of government, the judiciary is expected to be thinking down the line and down the road. Are they comfortable with a Democratic president wielding the full discretionary power of a unitary executive and deciding, doesn't matter what you put in the budget on immigration enforcement or defense spending or these other things, this is the newly elected president who has a different perspective and they are simply going to disregard it. It's going to be interesting to see how they try to navigate that in the long run. But my sense of this is that this has been the use of an ever expanding federal government to sort of advance these civil rights initiatives or clean energy initiatives or the environment or all these other issues. There has been a long-standing sort of commitment to stripping those things away. And the reality is Reagan never would have dreamed of this. George H.W. Bush would have never done it. George W. Bush never would have done it because at the end of the day, there was always some responsible member of their cabinet, their attorney general or White House counsel who would say, no, this isn't how our system works. If you want to do these things, you can't just destroy the Department of Education. You actually have to get Congress to pass a law.
Yeah.
And unring the bell and pull it all back. And the reality is what I've said all along is that, the Trump administration portrays this as a sign of its strength. And the reality is that it's really a sign of their weakness, because if members of Congress are actually forced to vote on and own the political consequences of all of these decisions, they're very unlikely to do it. I know they did a fair amount of that in the Big Beautiful Bill, but the bill on the Big Beautiful Bill is going to come due. And when it comes due, I have a sneaking suspicion the American public's not going to be very pleased about it.
Yes, sir.
Because they may have voted on stronger border enforcement or lower inflation. I don't remember anybody showing up to the polls, at least at the margins, and saying, I really want you to kill the Department of Education. And while you're at it, can you cut funding for cancer research? I mean, I have to go and campaign in places, and I have never heard anybody stomp and say, hey, folks, we're going to get the Department of Education and we're going to stop funding a search for cures for those kids with cancer like that. But his allies in Congress are more than willing to let this president just take a sledgehammer to all of these things. And what this really draws into the light is the proper scope of executive power as implemented through executive orders. Again, when I was in law school, executive order, we didn't really spend much time on it because it was always construed as these narrow sort of guides that you used to give people in the administration and heads of executive agencies as this is how you're supposed to implement existing law. Well, we've turned that on its head. This is going to be a whole new source of substantive law, unreviewed by the judiciary and unexamined by the congressional branch. And when you look at the Federalist Papers, this is clearly not what Madison and Hamilton, right? All this ambition, checking ambition. They weren't talking about a partisan balancing. They were talking about an interbranch balancing of ambition, checking ambition. Well, John Thune and John Roberts sure look like they're happy sitting on the porch and just letting their branches of government wither. And the question long term is that going to hold when there's a Democrat back in the White House?
That's the big question. Corey, can I ask a final question
Please,
of our guest? Sir, we know Corey likes to say the Constitution is only as strong as the officials who swear to uphold it. With this administration and their allies using executive power to bypass Congress to control independent agencies, what happens when the oaths stop meaning anything?
Well, this is when you slip into what some folks, I mean, there's been this conversation about authoritarianism, and I think there's a misconception of what modern authoritarianism means, right? It doesn't really mean, or hasn't meant in the last 50 or so years, the use of overt military power and police power taking over all of the streets of a nation. What it means is purging the government of experts, public servants, public officials who are committed to an enduring sort of ideal of just basic service. Like my mom was a public school teacher and my dad was a federal prosecutor.
Right on.
They viewed their jobs as helping to educate kids or helping to protect their communities. What Donald Trump is doing is shifting this to something that Viktor Orban or Erdogan, Turkey, or others would view it as we are going to purge the government of experts and public servants who should be independent, and we're going to fill it now with party loyalists and people who are willing to use all the instruments of power to target our opponents, because that's what you're seeing with universities, that's what you're seeing with law schools, that's what you're seeing with journalists who are being sued and forced into making these deals. And that has been the pattern of competitive authoritarianism. It's not so much taking over the military. It is using all the instruments of power to both pay off your friends and punish your enemies. And if you do that for long enough, you create a system where effectively you have democracy in name, but not in fact.
Yeah, we've been using the term self-coup to describe the process, not of a military coup, but of a president dismantling the other branches through usurping the power of the judiciary, usurping the power of Congress, and really undermining the role of so many civil servants in the federal government who have taken an oath to execute the laws, after all, and to demand instead loyalty, exactly as you say. And also, as you say, this helpful phrase of competitive authoritarianism. It's not that we get rid of elections or that we get rid of the other branches, as well, I say we, Trump, as he destroys them. You keep the veneer, the formalism, and hollow them out. So we couldn't agree more. I wanted to ask you, just to shift a little bit, I mean, of course, you are an elected official. You won an extremely important election, and congratulations, and I expect that you'll continue to do so. So I guess I want to ask, and you mentioned this in the beginning, you know, that of course Democrats need to campaign on economic issues, but the issue of our time, I take it, is this danger of authoritarianism. So do you have any suggestions and thoughts about how Democrats around the country, as we approach the midterms, as we approach state level races, how do we translate what all of us have been talking about? And our listeners are highly engaged in these issues, care about them, obviously. That's why they're listening to a podcast called The Oath in the Office. But how do we bring this message out? And partly I want to know, too, do you think there's hope of reaching Trump voters and getting through to them with the idea that this is not democracy, this isn't the rule of law, this isn't America? How do we do that?
Well, you saw in the Harris campaign a quarter. There were some challenges with the short run nature of her campaign, but there was at the end this sort of pivot back to the idea of democracy and elections and other things.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think that landed. I mean, obviously, or it didn't land. It lands with the people who are already thinking about it, right? The people listening to this podcast. They show up, they are clued into it and thinking about it. But most people, they really are just trying to get by, live their lives, and do what they need to do to make their family more prosperous, safer, all of those things. I think the key is to translate a lot of what we are litigating and talking about into the real world impact. So later on today, we're having a press conference talking about our lawsuit challenging the latest round of education cuts to after school programs and summer school programs. Well, guess what? Some of the biggest impact of those cuts lands in red counties in my state, in rural jurisdictions where they don't have a lot of after school programs and a lot of summer school programs. So rather than talking about checks and balances and the rule of law and the unitary executive, I'm going to be talking about, hey, did all the working people in this county that went for Trump by 15 points, when you voted for that, did you vote to gut the summer school program so that Elon Musk could have a bigger tax cut at the end of the year? And the answer is no, right? There's just, but they don't necessarily make that connection. Partly because when it comes from the national level, the national framing is around, from the Republican standpoint, waste and abuse, or the deep state, or all of those things. It's hard to talk about the deep state when it's somebody helping your kid learn how to read in the summer, right? Or someone who's there covering after school programs that you don't have the wherewithal to support on your own.
Right.
But at the same time, Democrats, we're not going to come. The arguments I make in this context and in this conversation that we're having is usually something that does not resonate everywhere all the time, because it's too abstract and it's too outside of their day-to-day lives. So I do think you have to center it there, but you also you have to connect it to this idea of the things that you assume about due process, about equal protection, about being treated decently. These are not things that you reserve exclusively for yourself. You want it to be for all of us. So you have to do it in a way that highlights people and places and things that they know, right? It can't be a lawyer's debate.
Is it a pushback, or am I agreeing with you in the thought that it isn't so much, because there is a lot of discussion, of course, that says, well, maybe it was just a mistake to campaign on democracy and we should pivot in national elections and local elections to purely economic issues. But I hear you saying something more subtle, which is, no, we have to think about how to bring them together. That, the attack on democracy, we were talking, for instance, about the threats continually to fire the Fed chair. And as John so eloquently said, that's not going to go well for the economy if the president of the United States is in charge of the Federal Reserve and we have a puppet, a Lindemann type there. And so that's what I hear you saying, if I'm right, that the key is to synthesize the idea that the assault on democracy is an assault on working people to be able to thrive in any economic environment.
So Corey, you actually provided the perfect example. People who are deep in the weeds on these issues, we jump in and we start having a conversation about should the president not have the power to fire the Fed chair. I would take a guess that most Americans are like, what is the Fed chair? Who is that? Right? Like,
yes,
I don't know what that is. I don't know what that does. I don't know I didn't know that they were appointed. How would I know that they're supposed to be independent? So instead of saying, don't go fire the Fed chair because that would undermine our institutions, what you say is, did you know if this happens, the cost of your auto loans go up and your mortgage goes up and like you just go straight to the consequences of the decision without wasting a bunch of time on trying to sort of define how all of these things in the abstract actually impact people's lives.
Right.
talk about how they impact their lives. And sometimes it'll be economic, but it won't always be economic. But what it needs to be is relevant to the what people are actually grappling with in their lives. And if I asked the question to a group of people in my state and I said, who here thinks the president ought to be able to fire the chair of the Federal Reserve, who is supposed to sit, they'd be like, what are you talking about? And I'm like, who here thinks that we should raise the price of mortgages? Or, right? Oh, they'd be like, whoa, don't do that, right? It's just the ability to think like a normal human and talk like a normal human and get into that kind of frame of reference.
Yeah,
that's right. Mr. Attorney General, we are so grateful to you for giving of your time and expertise to our show and for giving of your passion to these causes. What's the best way that our listeners can follow you and the work of your office and learn how they can get involved in the fight too?
Well, I would encourage them wherever they are to obviously support AGs, Democrats, and maybe hopefully one day Republicans who are committed to sort of safeguarding the issues and the things that we are fighting for. We often have kind of lived in obscurity. I'm one of the few AGs who actually worked in this office as a frontline Attorney General. So I sort of, again, I'm a victim of, or an example of what I was just talking about earlier. I just sort of assume that people know what this is and know what the position entails.
Exactly.
And most people don't. And so this idea, one of the things that does frustrate me is all of the national hand wringing and like, where are all the Democrats who are not standing up to fight? And I'm like, hey man, there's some people out there in the fight, but we're so busy with the fight. We're not gonna waste time telling you, like, just, you got to see it, and you got to, but when we do things, raise your voice, become engaged, show up in your community and let people know that this is a way for us to push back. Because as scared as people are and as anxious as they are about our constitutional order and our basic freedom, I actually think that this is not what the majority of Americans wanted. Right.
Yeah.
They didn't, even if they voted for Donald Trump, I do not believe, despite what all the rhetoric that comes from the White House is, well, this is what they voted for. They didn't vote for this. They're getting a whole separate bag of stuff that they're not voting on and didn't support. But it's up to us to remind people and talk to people about, what is actually at stake and who it's actually hurting and impacting. And people who listened to this podcast are obviously informed, engaged, focused on the right issues, but now they have to translate that into political action on the ground.
Yeah.
And that starts with thinking about who the AGs are, running for office, how we reclaim a slate of candidates that can capture at least part of Congress in the midterms and ultimately regain the White House. But there are a lot of people in the country still, despite all of the sort of concerns that we have about retribution and everything else and political violence, that we're standing up for the fight. We just need people to know about it. And I thank you for giving us the opportunity to sort of share that message with everyone.
Well, Attorney General Torrez, I've been following your work and the fight against birthright citizenship that you're taking such an amazing leadership role in has really been superb to watch, to not allow the destruction of the plain text of the Constitution, a basic right that says that our rights don't depend on who our parents are, that comes out of the Civil War. And you have been leading that fight. And I'm so glad, too, to hear about your hope that the law here will prevail rather than politics. And also to hear your thoughts, too, about how to translate the destruction that we're seeing into terms that will win elections. Because in the end, as we know, the courts are really not going to save us here. It's going to be right. Elections and elected officials and citizens themselves. So thanks so much for joining us. We didn't get to your important work about January 6th, but I hope you'll come back and talk about
I'd love to.
And other
Thank you, sir.
Thank you so much for joining us, Attorney General Torrez, on the oath in the office.
You guys take care.
Peace.